Hi everyone. I wanted to make a video about something I've been thinking about lately, which is the question of were the 1950s the best period in terms of cinema? Now I know there can't really be a definitive answer about something like that. People will have different opinions. People will say, well, no, the 80s were the best, or um, 1939 was the best year in Hollywood history, or what have you. But I look at the 1950s and I'm kind of mind blowing what was happening during that period. Particularly in terms of world cinema. Akira Kurosawa did Rashomon, Throne of Blood, Seven Samurai, and Hidden Fortress, all within that decade, and there were probably a few more that he did as well. And well, Hidden Fortress my isn't a I'm not a huge fan of that film, but that's the kind of film that would be the best film of an art director's career. That's how good a character. That's how great he was as a filmmaker. That even the stuff that you may not like as much, kind of trumps other people's work. And Rashomon was a film that really changed how the way people thought about cinema. Uh, Sorry about that. Yeah, it changed the way people thought about cinema and how a story could be told. As you may know, Rashomon is a film about people recounting this murder of a samurai and the rape of his wife, and we see by this bandit, and we see the events told from different perspectives, um, by the bandit, by the samurai's wife, by the samurai who was murdered via a medium, and we get these accounts via people who were at the trial, and it's told from their perspective as well. And by the end, you don't really get a clear answer about what actually happened. And I think that was very. I mean, today we're kind of used to ambiguity in film, but back in 1950, this was really different to have a film told like that and without a really conclusive ending. Of course, Throne of Blood, one of the great Shakespeare adaptations, maybe the greatest of the Macbeth films. Though I guess I would argue for Polanski's Macbeth as well. Um, but yeah, that and Seven Samurai, one of the great epics in cinema history. Uh, and then you also have Ingmar Bergman, who did The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries and The Virgin Spring and Smiles of a Summer Night, all within that decade as well. And yeah, Seventh Seal was also a film that really people I don't think people had ever really seen something that before, and at the time I think people that was the most profound thing they had ever seen. And yeah, it's probably my favorite Ingmar Bergman film, though I also really love Smiles of a Summer Night. Um, Also, you had Fellini with his films La Strada, Nights of Cabiria, and I was talking about Akira Kurosawa. You also had these other Japanese directors like Yasujiro Ozu, who had been working before, but the stuff he put out during this period, like Floating Weeds, which was a remake of his a previous film he had done. And then you had Sancho the Bailiff and You Get So. The director of those films was Kenji Mizoguchi. Um, those those two films are two of the great Japanese films. Are considered, I think, by many to be some of the great films out of Japanese cinema. And sorry, let's also not forget Francois Truffaut, who preceded Jean-Luc Godard by 1 year, as being one of the first critics from Cahiers du Cinema to make his own film. These were critics who thought French cinema needed to evolve and sort of get past sort of the classical era. And he, of course, Truffaut did the 400 Blows, which is, I would argue the defining coming of age film. And what he did with the Antoine Donnell character, and Jean-Pierre, uh, the actor who played the boy in those films, Jean-Pierre Liud. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he played the character of Antoine Donnell through several other films. This was kind of like a precursor to Harry Potter or Boyhood, or the Before Sunrise, Sunset, Before Midnight films that Richard Linklater did, telling a story about characters over a number of years. And yeah, I mean, I think Breathless was also a very important film in terms of the French New Wave, which is what that was called when these critics, these directors, I think they were all critics who became directors, made their own films. That's what the movement was called, the French New Wave. Breathless was important, but I think 400 Blows is what really started the movement. And turning from world cinema to cinema in North America, I mean, what was going on just in America was pretty remarkable as well. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock, in this period, he directed Rear Window, which I think that may be his most perfect film. He also did Vertigo, which I think many consider that his masterpiece. That's the film that just several years ago topped the Sight Sound poll. I believe that's what it's called. Citizen Kane was finally surpassed, and I would say something like Rear Window is a more perfect film than Vertigo. Vertigo, I think, would be the film I would show to somebody who thought Hitchcock was just a talented technician, just an entertainer. That's his most, I think that's his most profound film. That's his most personal and revealing film. So yeah, Rear Window and Vertigo, two of his greatest works, came out then, and also North by Northwest, which is a little bit lighter, but still one of the great entertainments I've ever seen. Most modern blockbusters and action movies aren't as, I think, enjoyable as that. Of course, Dial M for Murder, which was Hitchcock first time he used, I think the only time he used 3D, and I've never seen the film in 3D, but you can tell while watching the film what scenes, what moments are in 3D. And also To Catch a Thief, which is again another sort of lighter entertainment, but still very solid. Of course, Strangers on a Train, one of his most underrated films. Really great film. So yeah, what Hitchcock was doing, he's doing really great work. I mean, 1940s, 1950s may have been like, prime Hitchcock, arguably. But let's not go to the 40s. Let's focus on the 50s. You also had Sidney Lumet making his feature film debut with 12 Angry Men, one of my favorite films. One of the great courtroom dramas, even though most of it takes place in a jury room. It's rare that we get a film that actually takes place in a courtroom that's as compelling as this. I mean, there have been, but this is 12 Angry Men is a great example of taking something that sounds like it wouldn't be cinematic, that would be too stagey, and you know, certainly the camera work is subtle, but it does. Sidney Lumet makes something that does feel cinematic. That doesn't feel too stiff or stagey, and also the performances are so good. Henry Fonda, Lee J. Cobb, I believe Jack Klugman's in it. Martin Balsam. Yeah, great film. Of course, you also have in this era the emergence of a new kind of acting with Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire, which he originated the role of Stanley Kowalski on stage under the direction of Elia Kazan, and then Kazan directed the film version. And while that wasn't Brando's first film role, he was in The Men a year before, in 1950. Kind of sort of an underseen Brando film, but a very, very good performance in that, where he plays a soldier who becomes paralyzed. But yeah, what Brando was doing, people had never really seen that kind of acting before, and he's working on the waterfront, another film directed by Kazan, maybe the greatest film performance of all time. It's definitely up there. Maybe that's kind of the definitive Brando performance. The vulnerability, the masculinity, the rawness. It's just, yeah, that film captures a point in time when Brando was just, what Brando was doing during that period was amazing. Of course, he also did Julius Caesar, probably one of my favorite Shakespeare adaptations, one of the better ones, and Brando is also very good in that, doing a nice balance of sort of Shakespearean performance, but also bringing that naturalism to the role of Mark Antony. Um, But anyway, what else? You also had Orson Welles' the last film he did in America, which was Touch of Evil. I believe that's the last film he did in the United States. Um, yeah, Touch of Evil is, I think, largely considered to be sort of the last great film noir of the classic film noir period, which had, I don't know if there was like a set in stone date where this is where film noir began, this is where it ended, with something like that. But yeah, it is sort of one of the last great kind of traditional film noirs. As everything that sort of came after in the film noir, genre. Like a lot of people disagree that it is a genre, but a lot of films that came after in the 70s, that's when a lot of these films became neo noir. When they sort of became kind of self-conscious riffs on previous film noirs, or were indebted to classical film noir. But Touch of Evil was sort of one of the last of, again, that period, and um, it also has a notorious history for being tampered with by the studio. Orson Welles wrote was it 48-page memo or such. It's concluded with the DVD that I have. It also comes with the 3 different versions of the film. The one that was released in theaters, I think I forget what the other one was called. It was a preview. I think it was the preview cut. And then there's the 1998 version, which was based off of Orson Welles' memo, and the people who restored the film, went off that memo, and that version is as close to a director's cut as you'll ever get, in terms of Touch of Evil. I haven't seen the other two versions yet, but I think the 1998 version is the one a lot of people are familiar with. I think that's the only one version I've seen, and it's a great display of Orson Welles' visual imagination, and his ingenuity. That opening tracking shot is one of the great in history. And yeah, it has some of the thickest atmosphere I've ever seen in a crime film. Orson Welles, his films looked and sounded and moved. They were before their time, and there are not many films. I would say there aren't any films during that time that that feel like feel like what feel like Orson Welles, his films, what he was doing. Except for Night of the Hunter, which was the actor Charles Lawn's only film in 1955, and it is an amazing film, and I would have loved to have seen what Charles Lawn would have done after that, because like with Orson Welles, Night of the Hunter just looks and feels like not like anything that was coming out during that time or even now. It is this nightmarish fairy tale, fantasy, not fantasy, but horror, parable. It's just there's nothing really like it. Robert Mitchum has arguably giving his best performance in that film as Harry Powell, and it's a great sort of study of religion and the way Harry, the way Powell, manipulates people through, preaching and acting like this preacher man, and sort of like religious hypocrisy, when the people want to kill him at the end, when they find out that he killed Shelley Winter's character, uh, because he married her so he could find the money that her husband stole. He was in prison with her husband, and the imagery in this film, it's just so unforgettable and striking, and Long creates a complete world, or like a self-contained world that's unlike. You don't want to live in it, but you're entranced by it. So yes, that's an amazing film, Night of the Hunter. And another film that came out during this time was The Searchers in 1956, one of the, I think, early revisionist westerns. Um, um, John Ford. I don't think this was his last western, but it was definitely a comment on the westerns he had done before and the westerns other people have done, and he was kind of confronting the racism inherent in the genre, and John Wayne plays this racist character who's trying to find his daughter, his granddaughter, or his niece, who's kidnapped by Comanches, and it's all about sort of exploring uh, the the John Wayne character's psychology, and sort of him. By the end, he's kind of redeemed, because at first he wants to kill his niece when he discovers that she's sort of been she's sort of become part of the Comanches, and sort of has become part of their culture, and he wants to kill her, but by the end he brings her home, and there it's that great last shot where he's by the doorway, and he just leaves because there's no place for him there, really. And it's one of the great last shots in cinema history, and a great comment on you know on the genre. And what we saw in that what we see in that film, no, I don't think any director had really addressed the genre in that way before. Um, this was before, we had Unforgiven and a lot of those films uh, that we've gotten in the last 20 or so years. Yeah, again, about that final shot, it goes against the traditional riding off into the sunset ending. I mean, he does walk off into the sun, but it's a much more melancholy ending, and it's saying that this man really isn't a hero. He's been redeemed, but it's more complicated. Life is more complicated, and yeah. No, I'm not very articulate. Sorry about that, but yeah, The Searcher is maybe the greatest western of all time. It's definitely, it's definitely up there. Um, Also, another one of my favorite directors is Billy Wilder, and in this era, he did Sunset Boulevard, which is still maybe the greatest film about Hollywood ever made. I mean, it's very specific to its time period, but I think it still says a lot about fame and the obsession with, sort of people who have fallen out of the limelight, who still have a sort of twisted connection to their former selves and their former stardom. And Billy Wilder, what made him great was that his films had such a dark edge and such a bite to them, and he really dug deep into, American culture and its ugly side. But he was always sympathetic, I think, towards the characters. There was always the humanity to them. Um, and The year after Sunset Boulevard, he did Ace in the Hole, one of his most underrated films, with Kirk Douglas, which is about this. I believe he is it. My sorry about that. Kirk Douglas is this reporter who comes to this New Mexico town, and there's this guy trapped in a mine shaft, and it becomes about the media circus. And even to this day, you look at this film, and it's kind of like Network, how it predicted so much about what media would become, and it's still a relevant film today. And it's so bleak. It's so bleak, but it's bleak in that great way where it can only end one way. I don't think this film, I don't think you'll want this film to end any other way. And Kirk Douglas is giving one of his great performances. Yeah, and of course, maybe Wilder's most popular film, maybe the most famous one he did during this era was Some Like It Hot, which I think I prefer The Apartment, which came the year after, but Some Like It Hot, it was voted by the AFI as the funniest film ever made, funniest American comedy, and it's definitely up there. It's, even to this day, it is, I don't know if you'll laugh out loud at, but it is still really funny, and, it's this kind of screwball comedy with such a darker undertone, because it's about gangsters and um, Valentine's Day Massacre, and of course it has one of the great closing lines of all time, which I think most people know what it is, but I won't. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so I won't spoil that for people who don't know the last line. And I was talking about Marlon Brando, and during this period, also had other kind of actors who were very much like method actors who were bringing a sort of raw naturalism to their work, including James Dean, who only did three major films. Actually, he only completed one film before. No, actually, yeah, he completed two films before his death, but only one that came out while he was still alive. That was East of Eden, an Elia Kazan film, in 1954, I believe. And then he died, and Rebel Without Cause came out, and John came out, and I think that he had died before that was completed. I think some of his dialogue had to be looped. But yeah, James Dean sort of has this sort of mythicism um, around him, a sort of I don't know what you call an aura, because he dies so young, and because we, we never really know what his career would have been like had he lived, if he would have just flamed out, or if he would have gone on to do even greater work. We only have these three films, and yeah, Rebel Without Cause is probably the one he's most famous for, and sort of one of the defining teen films. Before we kind of got the stuff in the '80s, which reinvented the teen genre, with Breakfast Club and John Hughes stuff. Even before then, Rebel Without Cause was one of the more I think thoughtful films about being a teenager. Also a very tragic film, the way it ends. Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo are also very good in the film. Oh, with Billy Wilder, I also forgot to mention two other films he did during this period. Witness for the Prosecution, another great courtroom drama. I think that's one that's sort of compared to Hitchcock as one of the great sort of Hitchcock films that wasn't made by Hitchcock. Yeah, that's also an excellent film. Charles Laughton, who I mentioned before, getting a very fun performance. Really good courtroom drama. And also Sabrina, Audrey Hepburn, maybe my favorite actress of all time. She was one of the first, when I was really getting into classic film, her stuff was some of the first stuff I became acquainted with. And Sabrina, I think it was her first role after Roman Holiday, and the one for which she won an Oscar. Yeah, and Sabrina and Roman Holiday are both. Roman Holiday was directed by William Wyler. Uh, those both films, I think, kind of encompass how wonderful she was as an actress. And yeah, Sabrina is one of. It's not quite up there with some of Billy Wilder's, really great work. But still one I kind of hold close to my heart. It's a really lovely film. And also, Starlink 17, I keep forgetting the ones he directed during that time. Um, Again, that's not one I like as much as some of his other films, but I think that film was a really big inspiration for Hogan's Heroes. Um, it's a different kind of wartime film because it's about POWs during POWs rather than in the battlefield, and I think it gives a good insight into what life was like back then. Being a POW. And sorry, I keep going back and forth. I talked about James Dean. There's also Montgomery Clift, who also died fairly young. He was in A Place in the Sun, which I think I would say that's sort of the defining Montgomery Clift film. A really really wonderful melodrama. I think sorry, Elizabeth Taylor and Shelley Winters, both in that film. I think they both got nominations. I think all three of them were nominated. But yeah, that film's definitely worth seeing to see, young Elizabeth Taylor. And yeah, and Montgomery Clift's performance is, very strong. The emotion that he has to go through, the emotion he has to show, particularly in that courtroom scene. And yeah, what else is there to talk about? I know I just keep talking about certain films, and I just want to say, by bringing up these films, it's like so many great works of art came out during this time, and um, it's overwhelming. Looking back at what filmmakers were doing. Um, you also had In a Lonely Place, directed by Nicholas Ray, who also did Rebel Without Cause and Bigger Than Life. Bigger Than Life is an underrated, underseen gem about James Mason. This he's a teacher who takes this drug that sort of affects his life, his attitude, and he's hospitalized and he's diagnosed with this illness. He takes experimental treatment and it just really changes his mild-mannered nature. But going back to In a Lonely Place, that's one of the great Humphrey Bogart performances, one of the great doomed romances in cinema history. Um, really great exploration of a man who is always on the verge of exploding. One of the great character studies regarding you know anger and sorry about that. Sorry, I've been rambling a little bit too much, but so tell me, what are your favorite films from the 1950s? Do you think the 1950s is the greatest era in film history, or do you feel like there's not really a definitive, this is the best era ever? What's your favorite era in film history? What do you think about some of the films I've talked about? Sound off below. Yeah, that's all for now. Thanks. Bye.